Welcome to the Bible K through 12. We're in the fourth grade Bible. We're in part E, and this is going to be part 2, in which we discuss some special festivals and celebrations and days of remembrance that were found throughout the Jewish year, and a little bit about their meaning. Well, welcome again to the Bible K through 12. We're in the fourth grade of that K through 12 sequence. And this is part 4, or grade 4, part E, part 2. So we've been talking about ideas. We've been talking about those things that were part of the culture, part of the practices of the Hebrew people. And in this particular segment, we want to talk about the festivals and holy days of the Hebrews. We've already talked some about Sabbath, for example. There was a Sabbath day, but there was also a Sabbath year. The seventh year in each sequence of 7 was the Sabbath year, and they used that year to let the land go fallow. Now, farmers understand that that is an important agricultural process. It allows the land to sort of rejuvenate. There's something bacteriological and biochemical and so forth, stuff that I don't know much about, that takes place in the soil during that fallow year, so that it comes back ready to nourish the plants the next year. And so they relied on God to make sure that they got food enough, and they allowed the land to go fallow every 7 years. Then there was a further year every 50 years that was called the Year of Jubilee. Now, there are 3 interpretations of exactly how this worked, and there are also debates about other aspects. One is just what it says, that the 50th year. So you had 49 years, that 7th 7-year cycle. And then the year after that, you also had a year off. You had that 50th year, the Year of Jubilee. Others regarded the counting of the 50 to be within those 49 years. And the way the Hebrews handled numbers, especially counting days or years, is a little bit quirky compared to what we in our great knowledge do. And so it's possible that they were counting 50 years in that 49-year sequence. And so the 7th 7-year period, or the 7th year, was the Year of Jubilee. A third way is some people believe that 50th year was really not a year. It was just perhaps a year, a month and a half or so. It was a fairly short period of time in which all the stuff that's supposed to happen in the Jubilee year would take place. I do not know. That's just some things that I have read about this. At the year of Jubilee, what was supposed to happen was, first of all, the slaves would be set free, debts would be canceled, and the land would be returned to the original family owners. When Joshua conquered the land was divided among the 12 tribes, and then each family or clan and so forth had a particular part or plot within that tribe's designated land. It might happen that business, bad business, debts, whatever, may have resulted in some of that land being sold, but at the end of the Jubilee period, it was to revert to the original family ownership. Now, what this meant was that the price of land was to be calculated depending on how much time there was left in that 50-year cycle. So we could think of the full price at the beginning of the 50 year, halfway through, the price is cut in half. At the end, when there's only a year, it's only worth 1/50th of the original price. So in a sense, when you bought the land, you were really leasing the land until the end of that Jubilee period. Excuse me. Another question of scholars is how much of this really took place, and no one really seems to be clear about that. Nobody's quite sure. It appears that it wasn't always faithfully observed. For one thing, during the period of captivity, there are remarks that basically say, well, finally the land can observe its Sabbath. And so evidently there were some Sabbath years that had gotten skipped, and probably some Jubilee years too. But details of that seem to be quite murky. Nevertheless, that was the plan, and when you think about it, it was a remarkable plan. Economically, it was a remarkable plan. Sociologically, it was a remarkable plan. Okay, another special occasion is Passover. Passover, I would say, was the event of the year. Passover was our Christmas and Easter. In fact, of course, Easter corresponds to Passover. So Passover was a remembrance of what took place hundreds of years before, when the people were in Egypt. They were enslaved, and Moses was going to lead them out, and he had God-given instructions for them and all the things they needed to do to get ready to leave quickly. And that included the last meal they were going to eat in their house. For one thing, they were not going to put any yeast in their bread, so it wouldn't have to rise. They could just make flat bread. And they were to slaughter a lamb and roast it for food, but also collect its blood and put the blood on the doorposts of their house. And the Lord had promised that there would be a death angel coming through, killing the firstborn of every household in Egypt because of the harsh slavery that they were exacting upon the people. But he said, when I see the blood, I will pass over you. And that's where that Passover word came. It was a remembrance that God passed over them in those last hours in Egypt. And so the whole Passover feast was a meal that was also a drama. It was really remembering all of these details of what took place in Egypt as they prepared to be rescued from slavery. And so once again, they were reminded who they were and whose they were, that they belonged to God, that God had set them free. Now then, perhaps we might say a lesser holiday, but nevertheless an important holiday, was the day of Pentecost, or the Festival of Weeks. And it was 7 weeks after Passover. And it really was sort of an agricultural holiday, because they were celebrating the wheat harvest. And they were celebrating God's provision. And it was really, again, a recognition of God's involvement in their lives. It would become a very special day in the history of Christianity, that day of Pentecost. Then, somewhat later, there was a Day of Atonement. It really was not a celebration so much as a day of observance, a day of fasting, a day of solemn reflection on God, upon oneself and upon one's sins. And there was fasting, and there was repentance, and there was a special ceremony in which the priest would take blood into the temple, go through the holy place to the back room, the Holy of Holies, where no one came except once a year. And on this special day, the high priest would come in with the blood and sprinkle it on the covering of the Ark of the Covenant. And in a sense, the blood would cover that covering, and it would cover the sins of the people. And so it was a day of covering, a day of atonement, Yom Kippur. So then, sometime later, another celebration, another history lesson. The people would go out in public spaces, and they would make little booths or tabernacles out of branches and leaves, and it's almost like a kid's game. And they are remembering the fact that they lived in tents in the wilderness between Mount Sinai and the Holy Land. And so they are remembering God's provision for them, God's guidance of them, God's protection of them. They're remembering their history, where they came from, and the fact that now they are in a land that belongs to them and belongs to God. And so they had the festival of the tabernacles, or the Feast of Tabernacles, sometimes called Feast of Booths. A couple of others that began much later in the history of the Hebrew people. One took place during the Persian Empire, and there was a queen by the name of Esther, and she found out about a plot to slaughter the Jews. And she let her husband, who was the emperor of Persia, she told her husband about this situation, and he set forth a decree that the Jews could defend themselves. And so this became the basis of a festival called Purim, P-U-R-I-M. And it was a remembrance of God's intervention during that period. Then there is another, it's a complicated story, can't get into it, but there was another situation that the Jews faced in the intertestamental period. And it was the time of what we call the Maccabees, which was a family that led a rebellion against the Syrians, led by Antiochus Epiphanes, who was doing his best to wipe out the Hebrew religion. And during that time, there was a special time in the temple when the oil in the lamp did not go out. And so there is a celebration of that event that is called Hannukah. It is not the Jews' Christmas. It takes place around Christmas time, but it is really a reflection, a remembrance of God's grace and mercy to the Jews in that time period. Well, there are a number of other festivals and special days and other things that we could mention, but I hope this kind of covers enough of the material that you kind of get an idea. Hey, these people knew who they were, and they kept reminding themselves who they were throughout history. Thank you for your faithful watching of this series. I hope it is helpful to you. I hope that God blesses you through it. And I hope I see you again next time on the Bible K through 12.